Greetings and welcome. Thank you to each and every listener for joining me today for my podcast on What Brings You In. My name is Bradley Wenk, and I am an aspiring mental health counselor here to promote mental health awareness, discuss mental health topics, and spread some positive energy. Today is a very special episode as I am joined by Jayne Dahlquist, who is a licensed mental health counselor, a national certified counselor, and a certified neurolinguistics counselor, and very much a mentor of mine. I was lucky enough to complete my undergraduate internship with EJ at Creative Counseling Solutions located in Palm Harbor, Florida. Today, we will be discussing what it's like to go into counseling from both the perspective of being a client and also from being a counselor. We are also going to talk about how to find a therapist, what to expect from a session, and why mental health stigma exists, and ways to promote and manage your own mental health in your everyday life. I am recording today with the CoLab Studios in Clearwater, Florida, and as always, I want to thank Christina, Tyler, and the rest of the wonderful staff who makes this podcast come to life. This episode is titled, Let's Talk About It with a Counselor. Before we get started, as always, the views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely the views of the individuals involved and by no means represent absolute facts. Opinions expressed by the host and guests can change at any time. At times, this podcast may cover sensitive topics, and we ask you refrain from listening if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. Neither the company, the producer, the host, nor the guests shall at any time be liable for the content covered causing offense, distress, or any other reaction. I am not a licensed mental health counselor, and this podcast should not be used to substitute for actual mental health support. EJ and I both recognize and respect the confidentiality of clients, therefore no specific names will be given if we do discuss relevant cases. Documentation was signed between myself and EJ to discuss aspects of my own mental health journey. All right, guys, so at this point, if you are a continued listener, you know so much of what we have discussed in this podcast has revolved around the different areas in mental health where stigma is present. So today we're going to talk about why the stigma exists and how this does actually kind of hinder our overall mental health awareness. I knew when I came up with this episode, there was no one better to talk to than EJ. EJ has worked in the human services and mental health field for over 14 years, so she has definitely witnessed her fair share of stigma. Some of the areas of mental health where EJ has worked has been in recovery from sexual trauma, domestic violence and abuse, addictions and 12-step work, chronic pain and illness, cancer recovery, anxiety, depressive disorders, pregnancy and postpartum care, grief and loss, sexuality and gender identity, work among children and families, and in many of these cases, she also included applications of expressive art therapies. EJ, thank you so much for being here today.
Wow, thank you. What an intro.
I always try. We've got all of these things to talk about, and you come from a very extensive line of mental health. Because there's so many avenues you can take once you do become licensed. You can go out, you can be certified in so many different areas. So before we kind of dive into anything, can you give us a little bit of your background or tell us about what made you go into the mental health field?
Sure. And wow, those are two totally different tracks. So, I always like to laugh when someone asks me about what led me into this field. And the truth is it's my own trauma, and it was my own probably wayward self in life. And I had such a gift of being in therapy early. I would say early as a young adult,
right?
Not early as a child,
right?
And I had such a wonderful counseling experience. And I just thought, oh, there might be something here. But to back up a little bit, I've always had a helping profession drive. Whether I was, really young in school volunteering, I was always doing service projects or heading up service projects. And
right.
I think I got that from my parents. They were really involved in community and helping.
Right.
And oh my gosh, my mom would always bring home stray people, stray pets. Like we were just
right.
like the house.
That household.
Yeah, we were there. So I saw that in action. And I think that was a big part of it. Even though growing up in my childhood, we still had a lot of dysfunction and a lot of things to overcome.
Right.
There was still that idea of being connected in community. And when I look back in my family, when they were connected, we were the healthiest.
Gotcha. Right.
So part of my schooling, I had a hard time with undergrad. I thought I was actually going to go into deaf education.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
I was in sign language class at Flagler College, which is up by the deaf school in
Mhm.
St. Augustine, beautiful campus.
Mhm.
And my sign language teacher, also advisor, pulled me aside and said, "Are you sure this is a good fit?" I said, "No, it's not." And I was crying and I was
Yeah.
kind of a mess. And I was involved in a lot of things, had a lot of fun, probably was surfing too much on the beach,
Right. Yeah.
and ended up transferring, coming home. And I lived at home, which is Sarasota, Florida,
Mhm.
Manatee County, right on the line in there. And I
Mhm.
went to an advisor and I took all my transcripts, kind of a mess. Will date how old I am. It was back when you had a catalog and a pencil and you
Right.
chose your classes and you wrote them with a pencil and
Yeah.
you could erase them. It
Yeah.
wasn't digital.
Exactly.
And I said, "What's the quickest thing I can do with what I've already done to complete this AA and do something?" And
Mhm.
she came back and said, "Psychology and art." And I
Oh,
said,
okay.
"What? That sounds amazing."
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I took some classes, finished, did well, and then really thought I was on the art track, the
Okay.
formal art track, and had transferred up to Agnes Scott College in Atlanta or Decatur, Georgia.
Mhm.
Wonderful school, and I had great professors there who really saw that social justice piece in
Mm.
me.
Mhm.
And they had a program called Religion and Social Justice, but they let me self-design classes.
Oh,
So
wow.
I was working in a refugee resettlement community,
Wow.
and I just found art as a connective piece. I had 12 to 14 languages in one classroom at a
Mhm.
time, refugees from all over the world.
Okay.
And of course, I didn't know I was doing a therapeutic approach at the time, but I was finding a way that we could all connect, we could all heal,
Right.
everybody was so dysregulated. That's before I even knew what those words meant,
Right. Right.
It's
Yeah.
just a mess.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I learned a lot there. And so although I always tell clients when they come in and they have kind of that shame story about education, I'm like, it's going to count.
Mhm.
Whatever you've done or haven't done, it's still going to lead you somewhere amazing,
Right,
you
right.
know?
It's still an experience, it's still a story, it's part of your story.
Right.
Everyone has some sort of, I mean, even, let's say traditionally, if
Yeah.
the idea is you graduate high school and then you go on, you get a 4-year degree, you might even go on beyond that.
Yeah.
There were still challenges there, even
Right.
for people where it might have worked out that way for those individuals. So
Right.
there's always, yeah, it's always, we're always telling our story in different ways.
Yeah, and getting to see like where we did get sidetracked, maybe those stops along the way meant more than we knew they were going to mean,
Right. Yeah.
And that was the case with me. So some things that happened in there, some traumatic things that I overcame, which led me into a deeper dive into therapy
Mm-hmm.
myself.
Mm-hmm.
And along that therapeutic healing is where I thought, maybe I do want to become a counselor.
Right.
And just a side note in there, when I graduated with my BA, I was working for Big Brothers Big Sisters in
Mm-hmm.
Sarasota County. I was a field-based caseworker, so kind of like a bachelor level
Mm-hmm.
helping profession. I had 26 schools on my caseload. I had to see all these kids within a 30-day period. It was just nuts. And my boss at the time, really sweet lady, probably
Mm-hmm.
about to retire, and
Mm-hmm.
then she got me, and I was just this mess. And she would sit down with me and she'd say, "EJ, you know everything about all your clients, but your notes are a mess. Like
Mm-hmm.
you just have to refer them. You just have to link the service." And I would tell her, "Yeah, but you have to know what's going on with them." And and she said, "Have you ever thought about going back to school to become a counselor?" And I'm like, "Oh, no, no, I could never be the therapist." And the same thing happened ongoing. Like I would be in these helping roles where I wasn't the clinical professional,
Okay.
but there was that desire to know people's story.
Right.
And that is something I have maintained, I think, throughout my whole profession, is that curiosity to know people
Right.
and to
Right.
know what it's like as a day in the life of them.
Right. Right.
So I did go
That.
on to graduate school, and all those years, a lot of stuff happened in life in there, but I was really excited. And when I graduated, I landed a fully paid internship at the public defender's office in Clearwater,
Mm-hmm.
and I got to work in their jail diversion program. It
Okay.
was a pilot program, and it was really amazing. We proved through cost effectiveness we could reduce recidivism
Oh, wow.
by giving them counseling, medication, a bus pass, a meal, a
Right.
place to stay, treatment in some cases. All of that costs less than jail.
Right.
So we were really seeing the effects of criminalizing mental
Wow.
health, you
It's
know.
profound.
It
That's
was, yeah. And here I
amazing.
am in this office of like 80 something attorneys,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm seeing all their stressors. And you've been to my office, the candles and
Mm-hmm.
the soft lighting,
Yeah.
and these attorneys would be racing with these, huge stacks of charts and files, and they'd walk past my office and go, there'd be music and tea, and I'd invite them in between
Right.
clients and ask them if they wanted tea. So I saw
Oh,
that
that's
it
nice.
wasn't just like, yeah, like the indigent clients, it was also these well-educated attorneys that mental health was mental health, and
Right.
things started to click like, oh, wow,
Right.
there's a lot of the issues that are the same once we get our basic needs met.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, that's so cool. So then what made you go into private counseling?
Mhm. So from the public defender's office, I had some opportunities. I actually got to work at Moffitt Cancer Center and their healing arts program, which was just amazing. I got to work with people facing pretty serious diagnosis treatments, and I got to provide both studio art and bedside
Mm-hmm.
working in conjunction with the social workers. And I also worked at a treatment center, private residential for drug and alcohol and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I never really had the dream to become a counselor again. It kind of just, it was there, when I
Mm-hmm.
look back at that constellation of all those things. And I never had the dream to open my own place. Like a lot of therapists I've met, they're like, "Oh, I always wanted this." And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
"Really? I didn't. I didn't."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I love it. So from doing all those things, I started to see gaps in the system. And
Mm-hmm.
because I'm so relational, I wanted to be able to build relationships in my own community and connect my own clients with a safe psychiatrist that I trusted, or
Right.
a holistic practitioner if that was the route, or
Right.
I wanted to be able to wrap around and do these things. And I'm also a mom, and my most
Mm-hmm.
important job is being a mother. And I really thought building a practice would be able to translate better into a working mom's
Right.
life.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's amazing. Incredible.
Thank
Thank you for sharing
you.
that. I mean,
Thank you.
you've had so many opportunities in different avenues, and that's one of the
Yeah.
things I think really comes into your work, and it speaks for what you do. And there was a couple of things as you were talking, like good points, because we're kind of going. Sometimes I really do script these things to kind of ask
Yeah.
specific questions, but I think with you and I, and just how we function, I really just wanted this to be as we go along. And
Great.
one of the things we really want to talk about with this podcast is stigma. So I think to kind of get this rolling, I would say, how would you describe mental health stigma?
Oh gosh, there's so many different ways. I think the most important thing is it's just a barrier, right?
Okay.
It's a blockage to help.
Right.
It's going to run interference. And for different populations, that stigma is going to be different things. Like, for example, I might work with pilots who have incredible health insurance and benefits,
Hmm.
and they want closed charts, off the books, cash pay.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course, I do everything HIPAA compliant, but I'm saying their stigma is
Hmm.
that they won't be able to be reputable in their career.
Right. Yeah.
But when I was working as a second responder, mental health, with families in our community right here who
Hmm.
are maybe facing domestic violence or food scarcity,
Hmm.
their stigma might be, you're going to remove my child if you look in my kitchen cabinets,
Right.
right?
Right.
So
Right.
stigma, I think, for everybody is that shame, that link to shame.
Hmm.
And, I really love being able to identify those shame spirals and those cycles, and being able to work through that and normalize, hey, anyone in this position would be scared to have those cabinets opened, or
Right.
what you're telling me disclosed to your
Right.
superiors.
We always have a way of thinking the situation is worse for us than what it might actually be. And
Yeah,
I think a lot of people will go into that place, and that's where shame becomes exactly that barrier that you're talking about. And
right.
everybody feels it. I mean, it's
Yeah,
amazing. We once discussed a situation, it doesn't matter what your income level is. It doesn't matter what your career projection is. It doesn't matter
right.
any of it. I mean, everybody has it. We discussed once,
Yeah,
we talked about a home that you were in, and it was a very wealthy home, and they had some of the same problems as impoverished people and
that's true.
individuals living in communities where mental health stigma is just as present there
Right.
as what it is in the other. So I always say, and we've talked about it in a couple of episodes, is just talking about it really is one of the only ways that we can combat the stigma, because the more we make it aware, the more we discuss it, the more honest we are about it, I think the more we can help people, or a broader range of people.
Right.
We never know who's listening.
Yeah.
And one of the most, I talked about in another episode too, a little bit of my own mental health journey. And I didn't know what to expect in that first session. I didn't know where it was going to go. And if you recall, it was a lot of word vomit, to use a Mean Girls reference, as I always will. But it was just, you come in and you're thinking about your whole life, and you just start to spew everything at once. And it was, moment here. If you haven't picked up on it, EJ was my counselor at one time. And we will go into that about maintaining counseling relationships, because we had a beautiful start to finish journey, and now we're continuing it into a professional relationship.
Right.
And we are so lucky to be able to do that. But with that, we can go back and we really can dive into some of those aspects, because in that same way that I was having those doubts and I was having those concerns and questions, I think a lot of people who have never gone to counseling before, or even people who have gone to counseling and have had negative experiences, are going to be very hindered by continuing that relationship or trying to start another one. So let's take it back a bit and talk about, what would you say to somebody who has never gone into counseling before? Maybe they're considering it. What would you tell them off the bat to kind of expect, or so on?
Right. Well, the first thing I would commend them for even being curious, knowing that they deserve wellness, right?
Right.
Because it's, a lot of us don't even believe, we might think this is for someone else, or
Mhm.
other people can go, we could have a whole nother podcast episode on
Yeah.
the political, climate
Exactly.
of stigma and therapy and accessibility and all of that. But what I would say is to remember you have rights. Like,
Okay.
you absolutely have rights. You're no different if you went in and you were uncomfortable at a dentist office, or the receptionist felt wrong, right? We're
Right.
intuitive beings,
Right.
and I think we have to listen to that internal compass.
Right.
And a lot of times we think that everyone else is going to be an expert on
Mm.
us and our
Mhm.
healing. And the truth is, you really want a therapist who, one, has gone to therapy.
Yeah.
I would ask those
Yeah.
questions. Two, has trauma training,
Mhm.
right? Because what we know now is trauma is everywhere, and we're talking about it.
Mhm.
And if we don't have a good trauma trained therapist, we could be more vulnerable. We don't want to be opened up to that. Uh, open up, I guess, in a way that would be too wounding, and then not have a skilled professional to close you back up. Because we
Yeah.
still have to go and drive our car and open our mail and pay our
Exactly.
bills and feed our dog and do our things,
Right. And
right?
those sessions go very quick. So,
Yes. Yeah. So the other thing I would say is, do your research and
mhm.
ask around, and look at reputable sites, like Psychology Today is
Yeah.
great. Word of mouth is good,
Mhm.
especially since breaking the stigma is a part of this conversation.
Right.
I've got great managers that I work with in the corporate setting that they're normalizing in their staff check-ins. Hey,
Mhm.
remember we have EAP, get your counseling sessions in. Like,
Right.
so I'd say
Right.
just talk about it, and then
Mhm.
listen in your community who is talking about therapy. Ask
Mhm.
them, go have coffee with them, or
Right.
find out what they did. But the biggest thing is trust your gut, right? If
Mhm.
you go in and feel unsafe,
Mhm.
it might be for a reason. It might not be a good fit for you.
Right. And we've talked about it too, and I think I've said this on another episode, but it is in the same way that you were talking. If you go into a doctor's office and you need a second opinion, or you don't get along with, you're actually a realtor or a lawyer or whatever it might be. I mean, as
Yeah.
a client, we would say as a client, you have that right to find the right fit. And you
Yes.
kind of have that responsibility to yourself. And exactly, your gut is always your best friend. And if
Yeah.
you can't come to terms with what your gut is telling you, then maybe it is time to look elsewhere. And it's okay to
Yeah.
terminate those relationships. And honestly, the counselor should be prepared for that too. If there's no, I have a friend, and I can say this. I know we've talked about her before. My Kardashian friend is what I will say. And she's constantly just one of those that it's every time that I've listened to her, I try to come up with a new angle, and I'm not therapizing her. I'm not to that point, but I wouldn't anyway because I'm too close to her. But in my head, I've always thought, if I had her as a client, what would I how would I handle this situation? And it actually, I would bring this into the classroom,
Right.
and I would try to think of different ways that I could do. And there's just something about the way that her and I were great friends. But if it were down to that point, the responsible thing to do would be to terminate the relationship because
Right.
there's nothing effective that's coming from
Yeah.
the relationship. And every time I try to get into something and try to give some concrete get in, and it's totally sideswiped and it's put off to the side. She takes what I'm saying and she uses it as a way to talk more about the situation. She doesn't really want to help herself.
Right.
And sometimes those are and that's just one of many different situations that you can
Right.
come across where, hey, maybe this doesn't work. So let's go.
Well, you're also addressing a really important point is readiness, right?
Hmm.
Like being willing to go and wanting to go are really important steps, meaning am I ready to do this? So when I say intuit, like that comfort, it's still going to be awkward, right? Like I don't want
Yes.
listeners to think it's not going to be awkward. Just
Right.
driving there and pulling in and
Right.
walking into the lobby and and I know we also have a lot of telehealth right now, and sometimes that's awkward, clicking the link
Oh
and
yeah.
checking the
Yeah.
camera and
Yeah.
but I had an amazing, amazing professor in grad school, and he said the balance is, we want to comfort the disturbed, but we
Hmm.
also want to disturb the comfortable.
Oh, okay.
And so in the beginning, you want to feel comfort.
Hmm.
Why? You're building rapport, you're building safety. And it's such a compliment to me that you could come in and word vomit,
Yeah.
because to me that felt like, okay, you felt safe. You knew
Right.
your intuition said this is a place I can unload
Right.
and I'll be all right,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Well, it was
So
a very comfortable office. So.
thank you. So that, that safety is there. So listening to that intuition, but I don't want to send the wrong message to that you won't be completely comfortable either.
Right. You're exactly right. Yeah. And it's funny that you bring that up because when you changed offices after our first
Yeah.
session, so it was funny because the first office was a little confusing how to get in there because it was part
Right.
of a couple different medical
Yes.
offices. And I remember it was early in the morning and I'm not a morning person. And so not only was I getting up, not only was I just, blech,
Yeah.
but then I get those stomach issues, and I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh God!" I was like, "This is like the last thing I want to do." And then it took me a while to find it, and I was like, "Just get back in the car and just turn around. Like this isn't worth it. I'll apologize or something." And just it's funny to think now, like how far,
Yes.
I mean, how different my life would have been if I would have gotten back in the car.
I always
But
I always forget you started on Tiny Couch.
I
Remember
did start
Tiny?
on Tiny Couch,
You had
yeah.
Tiny
It
Couch.
was. It was, what did you say? It was like Wayfair? It was
Yes,
like
it
a
was like a
mistake on Wayfair?
dollhouse.
Yeah.
I measured wrong and
And I'm a very tall, big man, so yeah, that it was fun. It was cute. No, it was a good time.
that's so
But it
funny.
is funny to take it back and to think about that. And for anybody who ever has those moments, just go with it because you
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
And I know I shared with you my first counseling experience, and I did tell listeners I would share this story later, was
Yeah.
just it wasn't the best experience. I was on campus and I went to a school counselor. And so I didn't do my research. I actually don't know. I would assume that they're licensed counselors, or I don't know if they're maybe in their intern training or maybe they're getting their hours. But there was a point where I just felt uncomfortable. The questions for a first session were probably not, knowing what I know now, definitely not what should have been asked. I was trying to come out of the closet and I wanted to know, like, how should I gauge this, or how should I, bring this up to my parents? And some of the questions in that first session became very sexualized very quickly.
Mm,
How many partners have you had? How often are you using protection? And things that I just didn't really understand
right.
why they were being asked. And he happened to be another gay man. So I thought that would be a good fit because he would probably have some sort of experience he could share. And it just felt uncomfortable. So I remember just not going back. And it really kind of tarnished what my philosophy was towards counseling. I was like, oh, yeah, that one time I went, it got weird.
Yeah.
So there are times where, and it's just funny looking back, I'm like, I should have maybe, I mean, I'm not going to go back and say what I should or should not have done. Everything works out for a reason, but it is just one of those things where it's like, if it doesn't work, then you figure something else out.
Right. And I think it's courageous that you you did go back, but my heart breaks for that interim time where you weren't. You were seeking
Right.
help, and the safety issues important. Like
Hmm.
we have to watch that.
Right. Right.
Because again, therapists are people, right?
Exactly.
And hopefully they're a well therapist, that they're practicing self-care, that they're taking good care of themselves. But, if they're not, that's just as dangerous as I don't want a cardiologist who's stepping out to chain smoke on their,
Yeah,
like
right, right,
we want
right.
we want well people helping us be well.
Exactly, exactly. And that's a good point to bring up. So for people who are looking to go into counseling, what are some things that they can expect in the first session typically?
Right. So that's a great question, kind of paint the picture. And I also forgot to say there's all different types of counselors now. There's a lot of
Right.
different modalities out there. And I would say to encourage people not to get too overwhelmed
Okay.
by those things. Most of the time, we don't need to know all of that, but sometimes clients will say, I really want DBT or CBT. So that tells me they've done their research.
Right.
But I would say, your counselor is probably going to send you a link to fill out some paperwork. And that's a good time for you to kind of focus in on, what do I want to unpack? Maybe I'm coming for a very specific current issue at work, or maybe I really want to address some childhood trauma I have never dealt with, or I'm getting
Right.
married, or I'm going through a life transition, or so thinking about what are you looking for, that supportive, collaborative relationship to help you through, and be clear with that in your paperwork.
Right.
And even if you're not clear, having an idea.
Right.
Right. So a good therapist, and I've heard horror stories,
Yeah.
a good therapist will have read that paperwork before. They'll have thought about interacting with you, and hopefully they've even strategically for the next session placed you in their calendar at a good time. Like, I'm not going to
Right.
put two severely depressed people back to back. That's really draining for the clinician. I want to be
Right.
fresh. I want to be assertive. I want to be on my game
Exactly.
for my
Yeah.
clients, right?
Yeah.
So that first session might just happen where you got the opening. But what I would say is, depending on the type of therapy, it might not be a formal assessment like you would think,
Right.
because you filled out enough paperwork. Some therapists take notes. Sometimes in the beginning, I take a little notes. Sometimes I don't. It just depends on how my brain is working that week. But everybody's a little bit different. What I would say is, your takeaway for the first session is probably going to be, I don't know, anticlimactic. You're not going to get what you want from that first session.
And that's a really good point, is that counseling takes a lot of time.
Yes.
A lot of time.
A lot of time.
It's not you're going to go in, you're going to talk for an hour, and then you're magically going to be feeling better about whatever your underlying issue is, or
Right.
you're going to have an answer or a solution. And a lot of times the solutions or answers are going to be much different from what you might have in your mind. Because I remember going in and I was like, wait, we didn't even talk about what I thought we were going to talk about, because we didn't need to, and that was what was coming out was,
Right.
we don't need to talk about the things I thought that I really had to. And it takes more than just a couple of sessions, and it is something to be realistic about.
And even in these new modalities that we've come out with rapid resolution therapy and ART, accelerated resolution therapy, some of those trauma issues can be tapped into in 2 to 3 sessions. But what I'm seeing is the maintenance is really important to keep going after. So even if you're hearing about these quick fixes, as you know, transformation and change, there is no real shortcut. Like, we might have some quicker trauma applications, but just like our car needs to go in for oil changes and check-ins, and I won't pretend to know anything about cars, but I know about people, and we need that baseline. But I would also say an important thing to think about is, if you are going to therapy for the first time, don't just take that first opening and then race back to work. Like, from working with me, I always try to end sessions, especially if we've had a really big session and we've done some work. I'm going to ask you, well, what are you doing now? What do you have going on the next hour? Can you go get that cup of coffee or tea? What's the closest park that you love?
Exactly.
Where can you go and let this settle in? Because if we race back to work, it's not going to be effective. You don't leave the dentist with fluoride and, immediately go eat. So we have to create space for this stuff to settle.
Exactly. And there's a point with that too. I mean, from my perspective as the client, I would try to get to my sessions early so that I could sit in the office and just kind of take 5 minutes and just breathe and listen to the white noise machine and kind of get myself into this mode of like, no, it's my me time, you know,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what it becomes.
Yeah.
And, you know I respect telehealth. I know it's done a lot, but I really personally enjoy coming into the office because it does give you that time to
Yeah.
really set aside for you.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that's what you're working on. You know, there's so many other factors that are going to come in, work, family, relationships, but that time is for you. And then when you do leave, you were very, yeah, I would need my walks or the
Yeah.
coffee or the something, just making that time because, you know, not everybody needs therapy. Like you're saying, the routine work, not
Yeah.
everybody needs it weekly. Not everybody needs it even
Right.
monthly. There might be some times where you just do mental health checks
Right.
and that could be after. I mean, everyone is different. And that's kind of the thing with mental health in general. It's not, we've talked about this in the podcast before. It's not like traditional sciences where you can take a microscope and you can look at a biopsy and you can
Right.
see what's wrong. You have to do that work in a different way. And in the same way that in mental health, you can't take a prescription until it's finished or for the next 14 days and then
Right.
hopefully, you know, your ailment is gone.
Right.
These are things that take work that you don't always see.
Exactly. And that's why that vetting process is important. Like if I have a client, like say a female reaching out and she wants to unpack some really difficult trauma from her background that might involve sexual trauma or abuse,
Hmm.
I'm probably going to work with her in the beginning and say, hey, in the beginning, I might need to see you more consistently as a safety
Right,
feature
right.
because if we're going to open this up,
Hmm.
I don't want you lingering out there. So I'm going to check with her, like, what is a safe budget for you? Like, yeah, this
Right.
might be my rate or this might be, but one thing I have prided myself, I'm getting emotional because my business is 10 years old in November, is I feel that I have always, thank you, he's getting me tissues. I feel that I have always wanted to work with people that want to heal.
Right.
And if someone has come to me and said, so one of the things I have said to women and men and all clients is that I need you to pick a price point where
Hmm.
you can come consistently
Yeah.
and work with it, but it also needs to reflect a true investment in yourself.
100%. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there has been so many times where the client, the gratitude that's come from that, and then the work, and then the way they show up because they
Hmm.
know I'm flexing a little on where my rate is, and they're flexing a little in
Right.
their budget,
Right. Right.
and we're both working together to create continuity
Right.
and safety. And then we
Exactly.
stretch it out. And another spiel I've given for however many years is I want you to not need me.
You do. Yes. You said that in the first session.
Did I?
Yeah.
And it's such a counterintuitive business model, but it's worked because the truth is it's the hardest part about my relationship is because I pride myself on doing the work myself.
Hmm.
I want to give you all the good stuff. I want
Right.
you to benefit from all the trainings and the workshops. I
Right.
I want you to have that compass so
Yeah.
that you don't need to come back.
Exactly.
So even if it's not, rapid therapy, I want to give you the good stuff so you can go out and live your life,
Right,
you
exactly.
know?
And there's, you do touch up too. I think it is important to talk about the cost of therapy because
Mhm.
that would be something that might keep people from reaching out. I mean, there are many ways to pay for counseling. I mean, depending on
Yeah.
insurance, what your plans might be. Some people might even have that as a benefit through their workplace. We talked about that in a previous episode.
Yeah.
But like I did appreciate that when I came in, I think I paid you your rate the first time for the initial session, and then you were very honest about it. You said, "I'm giving you permission to be honest with me right now. What is your budget? What can you afford? And what are you thinking?" And we came up with a comfortable spot, and that's what worked for us.
Yeah.
And so it is important because I think sometimes when people think about the cost of counseling, they don't always understand the way that we don't understand businesses that we're not used to because essentially you are running your own business and sometimes people might forget that it's
Right.
we don't get a check from the government just for having a clinic that's open.
Yeah.
I mean, we still have to pay our marginal costs of
Right.
keeping our doors open and having the space for you to be able to come into, and that's not counting the cost of the graduate programs, which are pretty expensive and extensive. As I'm
Yes.
starting to do my research on that,
Oh,
I'm like,
yes.
ooh, that's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you do bring up a good point. Like as a business owner, when I went into opening my practice, it's as much as it's about people. You're right.
Right.
The hard part is I'm also back of the house. I'm payroll. I'm HR, and there were some months I probably should have fired myself, or, you know.
Right.
But on the spiritual aspect, I think it does even itself out. But there have been many hard moments where I couldn't take them at that price point,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
I could waitlist them, and I would be honest that I don't have that slot open right now, but if
Right.
it does, but in the meantime, let's get you some other referrals, let's get you
Right.
some books or podcasts to listen to. Let's get
Right.
you
Some
something.
some some resource.
Yeah.
Right. And it is, and and never take it offensively if,
Yeah.
your therapist is saying, no, I can't do that. They're saying that for a reason. And in the same way that a client would be saying to us, maybe I can't afford this rate. And if you're comfortable with a certain price point,
Sure.
I think a lot of therapists have that kind of sliding scale from what I understand, where you
Yes.
can kind of work it out because, I mean, obviously none of us do this. None of us should do this if we don't want to help people at the end
Right.
of the day. So we
Right.
do want to help, but we also have and then that's not even counting. I mean, that's just the business. That's not
Right.
counting our own personal finances as well. So a lot of times, it's like, oh, wait, it's how much for counseling, especially if you're paying outright or
Right.
whatever it might be. And it's, but the work, and I always laughed because I always had a moment in our sessions where I had the aha moment where I was like, oh. And I was like, okay, that was worth the money. Like
There it is.
I was like, okay,
There's the
that was
nugget.
worth it. Yeah. But you do, I mean, it did kind of, but it was funny because every time, like, she's not going to get the aha moment this time. And you would always get
Yeah.
the aha moment. And I think that would kind of parlay into another part of some of the things, I want to talk about, because this is about overall, but this is also kind of us going back and
Yeah.
forth and describing that I'm willing to talk about it,
Right.
some of the activities that we did, because there were a
Sure.
lot of really cool, I brought up in the other, the one on the workplace, I brought up the 5-minute rule where you were
Mm.
like, how does 5 minutes feel um, in the workplace, where it feels like it's dragging out and 5 minutes feels like 5 hours versus 5 minutes that feels like 5 seconds. And that was really one of the first times, and then
Yeah.
also reading Carl Rogers' book,
Yeah.
that got me to that point where I was like, wait, I really do like talking to people. And kind of like what you were saying,
Yeah.
that same, when I have regulars that come back into the bar and I'm like, wait, how was your granddaughter's birthday party, or that trip to Italy, or whatever it might be? And you just
Right.
kind of go right back into that, almost as if time really hadn't
Yes.
passed, even if it's been months.
Right.
That memory just comes back because I remember the stories and the people and their faces, and
Yeah.
being empathetic, you really pick up on a lot of those things. So
Yeah.
that was a great exercise. And it really brought me in. That was one of those aha moments where I was
Yeah.
like, oh,
There's one of those tools.
yeah,
Those
like
tools.
okay, like,
Yeah, and that's a good point too. You're going to counseling not just to stay in the past, right? Like a lot of people say, well, I don't know if I'm ready to talk about all that. Okay, but maybe you're ready to get some new tools in your toolbox to help you with, tomorrow.
exactly.
What would just a healthy Thursday look like, or
Right.
a Friday.
Right.
So yeah, doing exercises, doing different tools. And hopefully your therapist is gonna meet you where you are. Another question I love to ask clients is, how do you learn?
Mm,
Do you read? Or do you
right.
do art? Are you a musician? Do you
Mm-hmm.
would you prefer? How can I get tools to you? So I'm always tracking, because I can't expect them to have that same pedagogy as me. Like, they're not going to learn how I learn.
Exactly.
So I want to be able to have my own resources to give people. And you were such a great student. You
Hmm.
were writing, you were doing all the
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
creative, you're empathic,
Hmm.
and you're also very self-aware.
Thank
So,
you.
you're easy to work with.
Oh yeah, it was fun. Well, and there was another one. And it's funny because we will usually, I mean, depending again, every single client is subjective. So what my story is just me sharing my story. It's not saying that's exactly how it would be for
Right.
another client who would come in. And there are people who are in psychological distress, and
Yeah.
there are people who are maintaining a disorder. There are people
Mhm.
who are just doing the mental health checks. There are
Yeah.
people who are doing a first time visit. I mean, your day has to be very, interesting when you kind of look at it, if you blocked it out and you saw what each person was
Yeah.
coming in for, and that maintenance of a counseling relationship. I mean, you really see a lot of, I'm sure, a broad
Yeah.
spectrum, I should say.
I do. I see everything, and I think part of my gratitude is starting in such intense trauma settings like refugee resettlement,
Hmm.
second responder community mental health,
Right.
working at the public defender's office. We used to have kind of a dark joke. We saw everything except an adjustment disorder. We
Right.
didn't have any bored
Right.
housewives. Like, not that
Right. Right.
that sounds so cliche, but every we saw a lot of things. And in private practice, yeah, the packaging might look like it's coming in a luxury car, or
Hmm.
I have clients that come on the bus line, like,
Yeah.
I have everything.
Right.
And I do love the diversity of my clients
Yeah.
and the connection. um with just seeing all different types of problems, and there is that connection of humanizing
Right.
hurting,
Right.
right? We're all wanting to be safe
Yeah.
and seen, and we're all wanting to have permission to figure out who we are and
Exactly.
how do we go out in the world and find purpose.
Right. And that's kind of what we touched on earlier too, was and that's one of the things, the biggest thing I want to get from this podcast is that mental health is for everybody.
Yeah.
We all have it. We talk
Yeah.
about it, our mentality is always working. It's always at work.
Yeah.
And so just knowing that there are ways, and even if you don't think you might need the mental health services, or, oh, I don't need to journal, or I don't need
Yeah.
to do X, Y, and Z, you might not, but there may be areas in your life where you don't understand why certain things keep happening, or you don't understand
Right.
why you constantly feel a certain way, or maybe you've just gotten so used to hating your job that you don't know what else is out there. And that's also the tool, that enlightenment that I
Right.
think you can really get from mental health.
Right. And one other thing, just to say to any listeners that might be thinking, oh, well, we're really only talking about people who are employed with benefits or money. There are a lot of community mental health options.
Right.
And I will say, even though we say they might not be the most vetted therapist,
Hmm.
we all started there. And
Yeah.
I feel like the work I did there at that time was incredibly meaningful.
Right.
And I had incredible supervisors.
Hmm.
I'm also, well, previously, not currently because my practice is full, but Open Path Collective is another forum.
Hmm.
We can ask for scholarships. Like, there's a lot we can do.
Yeah.
And we have seen the move. I would say COVID's been very instrumental in being a good advocate for mental health.
Right.
We've seen a lot of companies increase their EAP. Their EAP is their employee assistance program.
Hmm.
A lot of clients I work with will come and say, oh, I work for this company. And I say, oh, great, you have EAP. And they don't even know what that is. So I would say start with their HR. It's
Hmm.
completely confidential.
Right.
They have no idea. They have no access to your chart, your diagnosis,
Yeah.
but typically through COVID, we saw them paying for 6 to 8 sessions.
Oh, okay.
And then we were able to call back and say, hey, they came in because they weren't sleeping and we were working on insomnia or stress. And now we've uncovered that there's something else going on. Now we're working on more of a depressive issue.
Hmm.
So they would give us 6 more sessions.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
a lot of people listening might actually have some,
Right.
if
They
they
might be
work
sitting on
for,
them.
yeah, if they work for a company. And if they don't, I would say there are a lot of things online now. There's a lot of these other companies where therapists like myself will register for Open Path, and then we go in a directory of therapists willing to provide so many services at a reduced rate.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a
Yeah.
great thing to know. I mean,
Yeah.
and that brings up too, I think another kind of reason people may not go into counseling, and something you brought up is confidentiality. I don't think people realize how secured your identity is.
Yeah.
There's even, there may be times when a counselor has to talk to another counselor, have like a consultation,
Yeah.
essentially. But even in those moments, the names are never given. Even triggers or identifiers may be changed.
Right.
You're just talking in a very subjective, or excuse me, in a very objective way about what a situation might be, and if you do need
Yeah.
the help. I mean, if as a counselor, I should say.
That's
Um,
right. It's a vault. It's a vault. And it's funny because, we talked about word of mouth earlier, and the irony is your clients will refer you their friends.
right.
And so sometimes they will refer to someone who may or may not be your client,
Right.
and they'll want to
Right.
include you, like, oh, so and
Right.
so, and I'll
Right.
say, I may or may not know who you're speaking. Like
Yeah, exactly.
I
You
can't
can't
confirm or deny
right.
that.
Yeah.
And you kind of have a laugh with
Can't
it,
disclose
but
that.
it is it's a vault, right? Like,
Exactly.
and I'll explain to clients about even, my other spiel is, we live in a big area but small town,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
typically if we're out, if you know me, then I know you, but
Mhm.
if you don't know me, I don't know you. And
Exactly.
all clients are different. A lot of my teenager clients, if they see me, they'll run up and hug me and want to
Yeah.
introduce me to their whole family.
Yeah.
And other
Yeah.
clients are like giving me the eye, like, look away. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm
Yeah.
I'm out of here,
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
Of
And that's the thing.
course.
Yeah, because we are, again, therapists are
Yeah.
people. So
Yeah.
we have our own lives to live. We have our own families, our own friends, our
Oh,
own.
yeah.
And so, yeah, sometimes those paths will cross, but it's
Yeah.
okay when they do, because you're still protected even in those moments.
Right.
And I think that's something, when you do go into counseling, even if you're somebody who doesn't quite give yourself enough time, you don't give yourself enough because you're stretched thin
Yeah.
between all of the stresses of life. I mean,
Right.
at least when you do go into that session, you're protected.
You
You
are.
are just about it's just about you too. I mean,
Yes.
your counselor is there to work for you. They are there to help you. And so
Right.
even if you never thought you could maybe trust a stranger, because essentially that's what a counselor is, when you go into the room, you
Right.
build that relationship and you work on the maintenance of that and you see how it goes. And that is why with a lot of what we're talking about, it is important, if it's not working, to find one that does work for you.
Right.
And there are a lot of people, especially like now that people know what I'm going into, that have shared their stories with me. And a lot of people, it takes a couple times to find a therapist that the groove just works. And just keeping that in mind going forward for people who maybe have thought about it and you've had those sort of moments where you've had to question it, I should say.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good point too. And of course, for the therapist, it's always funny. Like I can think of one time I was at Ace Hardware in my like incredibly embarrassing, like fluorescent orange running shorts, getting potting soil, like yelling at my daughter, and I turn around
Right.
and I'm like, "Oh, hi!"
Yeah.
Like,
Hey, how's
here's
it
that
going?
moment, right?
Yeah,
Like
right.
we're human, and
Right, right. It's like
but
when you run into a teacher
yeah,
outside of school, right? Like that feeling. Like I've had, even as a bartender, when I see guests outside of work, always at Publix and
right,
never when I'm looking good because it's always laundry day.
yeah,
And I'm just, oh,
right,
yeah,
yeah,
it's that moment. It's like we're people too.
right. We're
Like
people too,
we've all got our stuff.
right.
But we're kind of, I want to get into just a couple of just questions about within your career. Like what would you say is some of the most profound work you've seen when counseling someone?
So, oh gosh, it's such a great topic, but in question, and thank you for wanting to know that. I think
Yeah.
it's beautiful, the transformation. I think when I can see someone being able to live with trauma in their past versus experiencing trauma in their day-to-day life and having to act out and self-sabotage and stay
Yeah.
in shame.
Yeah.
And that happens and manifests in a lot of ways. So I'm very empathic, and
Mhm.
I wouldn't say I'm medical intuitive, but I definitely am body intuit. So,
Mhm.
when I can think of one woman I was working with who had a lot of sexual abuse,
Mhm.
and addiction was the secondary cause of
Right.
untreated, and masking it. And, she was really in a lot of physical pain. She had a lot of gastro
Mhm.
issues, which is not uncommon when we bury our trauma. It
Yeah.
manifests in other ways in the body where
Yeah.
it's all connected, right? So she was on this track to go have this really invasive surgery. And I said, I know this might sound a little woo woo or out there, but what if we brought your surgeon and your gastro specialist into the conversation,
Right.
and we got permission? You're still going to go do your labs, do your tests, you're going to stay under their care, but what if you gave me 12 weeks to work with you
Mhm.
to heal this trauma
Mhm.
and to see what happens before we do this surgery?
Mhm.
Because this is a type of surgery that would have been life altering for her
Right.
for the rest of her life. Her quality of life would have shifted, right?
Right.
Young girl, smart, intelligent, beautiful, funny, just
Right.
had all the things going for her. She
Mhm.
didn't see those things. She
Right.
saw trauma, she,
Right. The
yeah.
trauma's big. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the surgeon agreed. He said, I've never been approached like this, but I'm
Mhm.
willing to work with you as long as we, you know, keep her under her safety and
Right.
wellness is
Medically keeping her in where she needs to be. Right.
absolutely. And so we started to do the work because I could really feel sitting with her
Mhm.
that fire, that burning. I could
Mhm.
feel all that low. If you study chakras down in that sacral, she had a lot of pain in her.
Mhm.
And when we started to move some of that, you had mentioned the NLP work that I've
Mhm.
trained in and that trauma work, she started to get better.
Wow.
She started to walk around with her head up, and her
Mhm.
her labs improved.
Oh, really?
Her
Wow.
blood got healthier,
Wow.
her oxygen levels increased, and she never ended up having surgery.
Wow. That's
And yeah, it's
that's
pretty
incredibly
amazing. And
rewarding.
and I mean, that's the power. Like, people will come in and say, "No, this is real," like, meaning their
Mhm.
pain or their ailment, and
Mhm.
I'll say, "Yes, absolutely, it's real."
Mhm.
And so is the trauma.
Right.
It's not
Right.
like the body's listening to the mind.
Mhm.
So if the mind is telling the body all day long, "I deserve this," or, "I'm not worthy,"
Mhm.
what is the body going to do? It's going to produce toxic cells that shut down,
Mhm.
that don't know how to heal.
Right.
So I guess working in that genre,
Mm-hmm.
and that shows up in all types of work with people,
Yeah. Yeah.
but really being able to get into the core of that somatic body work
Exactly.
and move it. And then teach them, they know when that trigger, oh, I'm having that pain. I, yeah, I probably need to still get a medical rule out.
Right.
However, that's also probably the tell in my body that I've gone back to a traumatic reaction.
Right.
And where's my self-care? Where's my balance? Maybe I need that check-in appointment,
Right. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And there's always a moment too. I know I talked about the aha moment, but there's always that feeling when you leave counseling, and it should be
Yeah.
when you just like, I mean, even just feel lighter. You just
Yeah.
feel when I would always think about being in the car and leaving the office and just because you're right, it's right off of 19, which is stressful, but like
Yeah.
you get on and even, even just like getting on, it kind of felt like I was in La La Land a little bit. Like it was just
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, okay, and especially for those sessions where maybe you really did uncover something or you
Yeah.
got a little deeper. I remember you had me write a letter to my younger self, which was such a
Yeah.
really moving
Yeah.
exercise. And it was funny because I like went over that letter so many times in my head. And, because a lot of us have, and that's kind of a good point too, I think for people who maybe have an idea of what counseling isn't.
Right.
I think there are a lot of times where they think, oh, we always kind of the joke, we're going to blame it on our parents or we're going to blame it on our childhood.
Yeah.
And childhood is a profound developmental time psychologically,
Right.
your brain, where you're going, your growth.
Right.
But beyond that, I mean, it shapes you very much, but it's not always about specific things that may or may not have happened to you in a general sense. If there is trauma work,
Yeah.
obviously, or if there's a major event or something that you might have to uncover, but
Yeah.
it was a really interesting exercise because there were so many things to analyze from that.
Yeah.
And there were so many ways to see where my mentality was, I'm sure from your perspective.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
a great tool and it was a great little
And it's scary, right? It's scary. Like some of these things almost sound like a little cheesy or corny,
oh
but
yeah,
then when we sit down to do it,
right.
what did we do? We went into the body and we
Mhm.
accessed that inner child
Yeah.
and we went there.
Yeah.
We went in. And so coming back out and yeah, narrative therapy is incredibly powerful,
Right.
and sometimes we'll play around, we'll write to our past selves, we'll write to our future self,
Mhm.
but that one of the reasons, I don't know if you remember why I told you to write as well, is when we're talking, we're using one part of our brain, right?
Oh, right.
It's very liminal. It's just, we're using just one side.
Yeah.
But the moment I have you write, you are now using left brain, right brain. It's like a shot of B12 to your neurotransmitters,
Yeah.
right? So the neurobiology of what's happening when I'm doing anything. That's why if I have a client that likes to bike or swim or do anything bilateral,
Mhm.
they're going to move through their trauma quicker.
Gotcha.
And you
Gotcha.
did all those things. You
Yeah.
you you went for those walks. You did those things.
Mhm.
You were doing the bilateral stuff with the writing, with the
Right.
work, which is why you blasted through it,
Right.
you know?
Right. And that's kind of a good parlay into yeah, that's a good parlay into maintaining a counseling relationship because we
Yeah.
should point out for listeners, our relationship is having moved into the professional realm
Right.
doesn't always happen, and we
Right.
had to do it in a very specific way just because there is a lot. I mean, I knew you as my counselor, and I knew
Right.
you as somebody who really helped. I mean, I give you a lot of credit
Oh.
in one of the past episodes
You
and
did.
this one too.
Oh, well,
Yeah, but I'm
you did all
saying
the
like,
heavy lifting. You
well,
did all the work.
but it was, this doesn't typically ensue. And but there
Yeah.
was a point where we had to be very honest. It was when especially going forward,
Yeah.
knowing that my calling was to be a counselor, that this is where I needed to be. I
Yes.
knew, you know, I and you kind of described too, you're like, I didn't really need the psychoanalysis. I didn't need some
Right.
deep rooted work that we had to
Yeah.
do. I mean, we got there to certain
Yeah.
extents, but it was more coaching essentially. So it
Right.
was, we kind of always had that coaching relationship, but being able to terminate the counseling relationship is always very important. And don't be offended when your counselor does have that conversation with you.
Oh,
I know
yeah.
it's hard
It
because
is
you
hard.
always want to be there, but at the same time, if you're terminating it, then it means you've done the work and it means you've kind of gotten to a point.
Right. Right. When we get to the point in session where we're just chit-chatting,
Yeah.
it's usually, and I've had to have those hard conversations about, we'll do check-ins. Okay, we've had this many sessions or I do have some clients I've seen longer term,
Hmm.
but I will say they might have more significant diagnosis that
Exactly.
requires, like, even like you said, having me on the calendar every 5 to 6 weeks is
Hmm.
it's kind of like how we drop those pins on our map, or
Yeah.
it's a mental map, right? It's a mental anchor for them
Right.
that, so those clients that go longer term, it's not that they're not making progress. They just might be using the therapeutic process to hold themselves accountable and more of a coaching model at that point.
Right. Exactly.
But yes, excuse me, counseling, good counseling, it has to come to an end at some
Yeah.
point.
It's bittersweet.
It
It's
is
that double-edged
bittersweet.
sword, right?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had another great therapist, professor in grad school that said, as long as you don't cry harder than your client, you're okay. So try to
Right.
maintain that rule.
Right. But it is hard because I know you've talked about that. I mean, you do care about your clients. I mean, you have to.
So
We're
much. Yeah.
humans, and we can try to put up the trainings to be able to
Hmm.
make sure you're keeping yourself at a healthy distance, and that's also
Right.
another, I mean, that's part of the effectiveness of counseling.
Right.
So, if you do ask your counselor a personal question because you're inquisitive as a client, if they don't answer, there's also a reason to
Right.
maintain that. So,
Yeah. The other thing I maybe this is like a caveat, a little plug for therapists. So one of the things I've noticed lately, this new culture of the movement of removing the stigma, going to therapy,
mhm,
is every therapist that I know that's a friend and colleague is slammed. They're
mm,
booked, they're waitlisted,
mhm,
and as long as I've been in practice, we haven't had that, right?
right, right,
So what I would also say is try not to get discouraged, because when we call a doctor's office, they're often like, "Oh, well, we're not taking clients for 3 months or new."
right,
We've normalized it in the medical profession to wait.
right.
We haven't yet with mental health,
With mental health, exactly.
and it's so hard because I've made the mistake of overbooking and then having people, something I said would never happen in my time, but I've had
Yeah,
people fall through the cracks or not get called back in time.
yeah,
And we just don't wanna operate that way,
right,
right? So
right,
I would say if they're full for a reason,
right,
and they're worth waiting maybe for that slot.
right.
But it
And
is new. It's a new discussion on that.
yeah,
Sorry.
exactly. And in the meantime, trying to find those resources, the online
Right.
references to things. I mean, especially if you're in severe distress, to be
Right.
able to find those because it is, yeah, it might be. And at that point, maybe there are different routes. The community,
Right.
the potentially having to go to some sort of facilitated area to do the counseling and
Sure.
to get the help.
Yeah.
But
And
there's, yeah,
I was
no,
gonna say in the check-in, right? Like, so some of the conversations I've had to develop as this has happened over the last couple years through COVID is, okay, well, our appointment's not till here, but in the meantime, I want to remind you, go back to the basics. What are you eating? What are you drinking? How are you sleeping? What's your
mhm,
self-care look like? We'll talk, and that just to give them to start looking proactively at
right,
their own landscape,
exactly,
what
yeah,
they can be doing from now till then.
exactly,
And sometimes they'll come in and go, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I started right away
mm,
realizing I needed to go for a walk, or I hadn't had any water in 2 days." And
right,
something, we just need simple resets.
right,
And
exactly.
wellness should be simple,
Exactly,
you know.
exactly. Well, I mean, we've hit so many points, and I know this is always like a pressure question,
Yes.
but I mean, as we're kind of wrapping this up, is there anything else you would like to say to any listeners or any finishing thoughts or anything?
I just want to thank you,
Oh,
Bradley.
thanks.
I think you're incredible. I think you're so courageous in your healing,
Oh,
and I've
thank you.
watched you just go after your dreams and remove your
Oh,
barriers.
thank you.
And it's so like, I feel like that proud mama therapist moment, but I also am so hopeful,
Right.
because as I step down, people like you are stepping in.
Aw.
And I just know you're going to help so many
Oh,
people.
well, okay. All right.
Here's the tissues
Can we
back.
put a joke in here or something? Like, my God.
And I
No.
got to see you on the tiny couch. The
I
tiny
know.
couch.
Well, we're going to bring back the tiny couch.
Oh, I
Okay.
know.
Well, I do want to give another big thank you to you, EJ, for being here today. Again, on a personal level, I could never thank you enough for all that you have done and for just continuing your work in the mental health field. I mean, I've always said with this podcast, we don't know where this is going to go. I mean,
Right.
honestly, and my whole thing with it is if it reaches one person, or 40,000 or 40
Right.
million, at least it helps one person. And I really
Sure.
think from our conversation today, we at least helped one, and that's all that we can
That's
ask
great.
for. I know
Yeah.
somebody out there maybe is going to pick up the phone and they're going to make that call. And
Right.
I encourage you to do so. I know that I speak for you when you say that you do as well, and keep going at it. That's the
Yeah.
thing. If you don't get in right away, if that relationship with your counselor is not working, just always remember to focus on yourself. Keep that awareness open,
Yeah.
and to move forward.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I would say another also a big thank you to the Collab Studios for their help, their resources, and their staff. And as always, I want to thank each and every listener for tuning in today. My name is Bradley Wink, and this has been an episode of On What Brings You In Today. As always, if you or anyone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, you can call or text 988, or you can go to 988lifeline.org. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.